Hello, everyone. Today we'll start talking about René Descartes, one of the great thinkers in history, one of the great philosophers, mathematicians. He lived a few hundred years after Thomas Aquinas. The dates are 1596 to 1650. And he was in the midst of a crucial revolution within philosophy, within science itself. He was one of the great pioneers of that revolution. So let's look a bit more carefully about the role that he played in defining the very conception of thinking, of philosophy or science. So we think of Descartes as the father of what we call early modern philosophy. And early modern philosophy is the kind of philosophy that was dominant in the 17th, 18th centuries in Western Europe. Uh, and he is the father because he, in many ways, rejected a lot of what was happening in the past. The philosophy as done by the medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, a lot of the crucial assumptions built into it that are traceable all the way back to Aristotle, Descartes challenged. And he challenged to provide an alternative way of thinking, a radically different way of conceiving of very philosophical questions, scientific questions. And the way in which Descartes approached those philosophical questions, those scientific questions, shaped the philosophical debates for 200 years, for the medieval period, 17th, 18th centuries. So he's a major player to be taken seriously. Descartes was a mathematical genius. He made many mathematical breakthroughs. For example, he invented or discovered analytic geometry. So we still have, we name, for example, the Cartesian coordinates after Descartes Cartesian, because he's the one that used them to be able to develop some of the basic skills for what analytic geometry is. And more generally, he was very impressed with the clarity and rigor of math. He was impressed with the fact that you can do a proof, prove a theorem, mathematical theorem, and then it had to be true. He was impressed with reason's ability to demonstrate necessarily some truths that were beyond doubt. Math was so clear, so rigorous, and it had to be true. He was very impressed by that. And he looked around, he looked outside of math, and he noticed that the sciences, the philosophy, did not have that rigor, did not have the clarity. And he was moved to incorporate some of the methodologies, the clarity and rigorousness of math into philosophy and reshape the very kind of methodology for doing philosophy. Also crucially relevant is that the religious context in which Descartes was writing. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had served as the ultimate court of appeal for religious truth claims. So the Catholic Church had kind of centralized authority in matters religious, and religion was a way of unifying society. So that the Catholic Church held that kind of centralized power, religious power, created a kind of homogeneity within Christendom that was, more or less a homogeneous religious community that more or less functioned with all these Christian assumptions that were backed by the authority of the visible Catholic Church. By the time Descartes is writing, however, this is the Reformation has passed. I mean, this is right in the middle of the aftermath of the Reformation. And one of the consequences of the Reformation is the undermining of the centralized authority that the Catholic Church has over religious truths, which were unifying society, which were grounding the cohesiveness of society. And breaking that authority effectively created this chaos, this societal chaos, this transition away from unifying societies grounded in visible religious authority onto something else. And the something else was not clear. It was being defined by the great thinkers of the moment. One of the consequences in that trying to redefine what society was and what civilization was and so on was this rampant religion disagreement. Once there was no longer a visible authority that was the ultimate court of appeal for religious truths, all sorts of religious claims started becoming dominant. I mean, Descartes himself was puzzled by this. He was a believer, he was a Christian, and he was very puzzled by the rampant disagreement that Christians had amongst themselves. And he thought that that disagreement counted against the rationality, the credibility, or perhaps even the truth of religious claims. He was very moved by that. He was very bothered by that. And he was bothered by similar considerations in philosophical and scientific enterprises. So here are some of the main goals that drive the extremely ambitious project that Descartes undertakes. One was to distinguish and defend legitimate Christian beliefs from otherwise widespread religious superstition. Um, and being a philosopher, he uses reason, human reason, as a guide for, or the main tool for defending Christian beliefs. So he's pretty much in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, in which reason is the legitimate, one can legitimately utilize human reason to try to attain all sorts of truths about the divine or Christian truths or religion's truths. Descartes is a participant in that. He wants to establish, one, that God exists, two, the nature of God, three, the soul exists, that it is immoral, and the kind of thing that the soul is. So a lot of very religious sounding claims or doctrines, Descartes wants to defend on the basis of reason, to separate from what, you know, all of the superstition that is happening, that he's bothered by. That's one of the major goals that shapes his projects, his philosophical scientific projects. A more purely philosophical goal that he has is to find knowledge that is certain, that is indubitable, that has to be true. Much like in the religious domain, in which he's very bothered by so many people disagreeing about the fundamental aspects of it, whether baptism is required for salvation, what salvation is, and things like that, like fairly basic religious questions. People have very different answers to those fairly basic religious questions. And he was very bothered because he wanted to know the truth. And if there are so many options, they cannot all be true. And he was not sure how to go about establishing which of the alternatives, if any, was the correct one. So that kind of being bothered by the disagreement was not only present in the religious context, it was also present in the philosophical and scientific context. He was also very aware that, say, Thomas Aquinas was not the only game in town. There were other competing and incompatible conceptions of the nature of philosophy, or answers to philosophical questions that were part of the academia, part of the university setting. And Descartes was likewise very bothered. He realized that the fact that there were multiplicity of answers to philosophical questions undermined, or at the very least challenged, the credibility of those answers. He wanted to know how to go about knowing the truth, which of those answers were the right answers. And he thought that a way of attaining that was by devising a method whose conclusions were indubitable, were certain, they could not be mistaken. So his bar for human knowledge is as high as it gets: indubitability, incapable of being doubted. Certitude, you must be correct. Anything that is purely fallible or purely statistical, he thinks that's not worthy of true knowledge. That's a lesser kind of category. And he talks about the edifice of knowledge. He realizes that a lot of our beliefs are structured. Though we believe some things that are based or predicated upon other beliefs, which are themselves based or predicated on other beliefs and so on, they look like a house. There are some very fundamental beliefs, which are the foundation, and then beliefs are built upon that, and which are built upon that, and then other beliefs are built upon that. And we understand reality through that house, that edifice of knowledge, that complicated web of beliefs that structure in a particular way. And Descartes noticed that if the foundations, the more fundamental beliefs upon which other beliefs are based, are fallible or can be mistaken, that sheds into doubt, that throws doubt into the entire edifice, that makes the entire web of human beliefs, makes it all, you know, uncertain. It can all be mistaken. And that really bothers Descartes. He wants to know the truth. He wants to begin or build the whole of human knowledge on foundations that are certain, that cannot be doubted. And that is his goal: to attain knowledge, a kind of knowledge that is certain, that cannot be known, that cannot be shaken, and then build philosophy, science, religious truths, all of the edifice of knowledge, build that on top of certain foundations. That's a major goal, and we'll look into that more carefully. And there's a third goal that might seem strange to our contemporary ears, and that is to provide what is technically referred to as first philosophy. And the first philosophy is a philosophy that grounds the credibility of empirical science. Descartes is writing at the beginning of a huge transition in ways of thinking of philosophy, but also a huge transition in science. Math, I think he's one of the pioneers doing this. Math is becoming integral into the very scientific way of thinking and describing the world. Um, so Descartes is shaping the way of thinking about science itself. And one of the things that Descartes and a lot of contemporary people of his time think that science as an empirical enterprise is in need of justification, that we must put forth reasons, arguments that justify the very assumptions that give rise to the scientific method. Um, in a contemporary perspective, many of us think that, oh, science justifies itself, or does not stand in need of justification, is the best method we have for attaining truth. But that's a subsequent development of understanding the very method of science. Early on, during Descartes' time, 17th century, 18th century, people had deep questions, real questions about the credibility of some of the crucial assumptions in the very scientific methodology. And Descartes thought that if science is empirical, that is based on the deliverance of sensation and then reason operating upon that, that the senses are not strong enough, are not credible enough, are not indubitable. The senses or the deliverance of the senses can be mistaken. That makes the whole edifice of science be shaky or be uncertain, be merely probabilistic, be merely statistical knowledge. And that's not good enough. That could be mistaken, and that's not true knowledge, and that's certain knowledge. So Descartes' goal is to provide a philosophy that is indubitable, that is certain, and upon which empirical science can be based, and upon which empirical science can be justified. So it's a very ambitious goal as well, and we'll look at some of that. So there's a distinction that becomes prominent in the early modern period, and it begins with Descartes, though it's operative, it's operating throughout the history of philosophy. It goes all the way back to Plato, at least, probably before Plato. And there's a distinction between rationalism and empiricism. Let's make those words more careful, define them more carefully. So rationalism is the following view, or it's a good way of articulating rationalism. Ultimately, humans know what they know because of their reason. It is the capacity that humans have to reason that ultimately grounds all human knowledge. And a different way of saying the same thing is to say that reason is the ultimate court of appeal in knowledge. Rationalists can be skeptical of the senses. They don't need to be skeptical, but to be a rationalist is to inquire into the justification for believing the deliverance of the senses, that you're sensing something that rationalists will think is not yet sufficient reason for thinking that you know that, the thing that you're sensing, because your senses can be mistaken. How do you know your senses are not mistaken will be a question that the rationalists will ask. But in any case, true knowledge requires reason, and the senses at best provide data that then reason must corroborate. It is reason that grounds human knowledge. Opposed to that is empiricism. Empiricism says or claims that ultimately humans know what they know because of the senses. It is the senses that provide the ultimate court of appeal. So like Aquinas would say, the senses are the 5 windows onto reality. It is the senses that provide you an access to reality. And then reason, well, reason just kind of operates upon, works upon the deliverance of the senses. And the judgments of reason must be kind of vindicated or verified, empirically verified by the senses. It is experience based on the senses that provides the connection between your thoughts, your theoretical postulates, in the way the world is. That you reason something, that you think about something, does not yet give you any connection to reality. You must have experiments. You must have occasions for sensing something that vindicate or verify those judgments, those thoughts, those operations of reason. To say those things, to claim those things, to think those things are correct, is to be an empiricist. There's a deep fundamental disagreement between rationalism and empiricism. The rationalist thinks that the mere fact that you're sensing something is not yet enough a good justification for you to believe it, because the senses are, deceptive. They can be false. They're fallible. Reason is the ground of things like math, necessity, certainty, and therefore reason must be brought to bear to justify, to verify, to corroborate the deliverance of the senses. The empiricist has it in the reverse. So think of, for example, St. Anselm's ontological argument. It's a purely a priori argument. It is true, or it purports to be true, purely on the basis of reason, thinking about the logic of being without any kind of empirical or sensory input. And a rationalist like St. Anselm would say that's so much the better. That means that it is like math. It cannot be mistaken. It has to be true. It's not merely probabilistic, it's certain. A empiricist like Thomas Aquinas would pretty much just dismiss the argument without looking at it very carefully, precisely because it's a priori, precisely because it does not begin with or is not corroborated or verified by sensation, that it is not verified or corroborated or even does not start with sensation. Someone like Aquinas, an empiricist, will take as grounds to dismiss. But of course, that does not settle the dispute between the rationalist and the empiricist, that the empiricist dismisses the rationalist arguments because they're not empiricist, and that the rationalist dismisses the empirical's claims because they're empiricist and not rationalist, does not count in favor of one or the other, right? It just illustrates their assumptions about human knowledge. One of the great beauties of Descartes, he's a rationalist, one of the great beauties is that he gives you very persuasive reasons for thinking that empiricism is not a good ground for knowledge. And we'll look at those shortly. But let's stop here for now. I will see you next time.